today we actually have Tony Destefano on the phone from Newsday. Tony, you there?
I'm here.
All righty. So what a story that you have for us, right?
Yeah, I covered the as it were, apprehension/rescue at the Statue of Liberty on July 4th.
Yeah.
So that was a big event.
That's crazy. So for the people who are hiding under a rock and do not know what happened on July 4th at Liberty Island, why don't you tell them exactly what happened?
Well, briefly, a woman who has issues and complaints about U.S. immigration policy, specifically the Trump administration, Teresa Okumu is her name, from Staten Island. She scaled up to the pedestal of the statue on July 4th at about 3:15 in the afternoon and was doing her protest, as it were. The result was, of course, that the NYPD and the Parks Police responded, and after about 3 or 4 hours of sort of high-altitude events, the cops, the NYPD officers, took her into custody with a belt and a safety harness and escorted her off the pedestal. Yeah. And she was then the next day charged with 3 misdemeanor counts in federal court. Because the statue, of course, is federal property.
Right.
It's run by the Park Service, and it's actually part of, geographically, by some agreement from years ago, it's part of New York City.
Right.
So it was handled in Manhattan federal court.
Okay. So, that's got to be crazy. Like, for me, I feel kind of angry about this. Look, I want to hear your opinion, Tony, if you want to, but, I feel like, look, you could protest all you want, but I wouldn't go as far as climbing Lady Liberty. I think that's going a little too far.
Well, I mean, I'm constrained as to, what I can say in terms of my opinion, but be that as it may, the federal prosecutors and the police have been very out front about how they feel about it, but basically, by doing that, she put people in harm's way, the police officers. I mean, look, they're trained to do this stuff, but, there's always a risk.
Yeah.
And there were people who went to the island who complained about suddenly being shut out of the island, having forced to evacuate. And some of them really were very disturbed because they didn't know what was going on.
Right.
And the police have said that this was a dangerous situation. The federal government said, the prosecutor said this was a substantial danger to the cops and, of course, to herself.
Yeah.
So this is the position. And I've been getting pushback not pushback, but comments from readers who are very angry with what happened. I think much the way you were.
Exactly. I don't think anybody would want that. And it's extremely weird because I heard that she climbed just going upward. She just went up, right? Well,
yeah, she said she did a pull-up. And the police I've spoken to have said that they think she may have had a boost from somebody.
Yeah, you can't get a pull-up.
There's no way you can do that.
Right.
Unless you're like that. An animal who can scale high buildings.
Exactly.
It's hard, and she got up to about the skirt, the lower edge of the skirt, where the foot is.
Right.
The elevated right foot, I think it is, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
That's where she was.
And I want to get this correct. Do you know how long she was up there? I know you mentioned it before. Was it like 3 hours?
Well, they got the call at about 3:15. She was in custody at 7.
Oh, okay.
So you figure it's pretty close to 4 hours.
Wow, because,
look, there was a breeze, luckily, but it was a hot day.
You can tell because it's online, but you can tell the footage, it's sped up, but you can tell that she was just trying to protest, and the police, they had ropes just trying to grab her, and she just didn't want to go,
Yeah, no, there was a point, and the officers have said this, that she, threatened at one point to kick the ladder down.
Yeah.
At that point, they sort of backed off, and they waited for their guys to get, lanyard. They dropped the rescue lines down from the crown, interestingly enough, and they hooked the cops up to their harness. And then they were free to work at that point. It's a very precarious position.
Yeah.
That skin on that statue, the National Monument, is really just millimeters thick.
Yeah.
Somebody told me it's like the width of 2 pennies. with the thickness of 2 pennies. That's pretty thin.
Right.
And I don't know if there's any damage done, but at some point we'll probably learn if there was.
Right. Yeah, because you can tell, because I don't know. It looks like the floor, like the material that she was standing on. It looks kind of slippery to kind of
Yeah, it is. It's inclined. It's like it's designed to show a robe, and it's folded, and it's inclined, and it wasn't the easiest surface to work on.
Right.
And the cops had to be careful. They had to be careful for themselves. They had helmets on in case they did fall, and they had to be careful for her.
Right.
And this is not something the cops expected, although they do train for a lot of high elevation rescues.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't out of their wheelhouse, but it was a different different situation.
It definitely was, and I know she was part of a group. I don't remember what the group's name was.
Yeah, there's been a couple of groups that were involved, I think, but suffice to say, there are groups that are protesting the immigration policy.
Right, there were groups that
detention of children.
Right, that were there talking about abolish ICE, and I think she was part of that group, and the group I think left because the police escorted them out. Right.
Yeah, well, they apparently had done their protest or whatever they did. They unfurled some signs.
Right.
And then they left, and she sort of stayed behind. It remains to be seen whether she had some assistance to getting boosted up that high.
Right.
Because the police think that she may have had some assistance.
Yeah, and then other members of that group, they were like, we didn't know that she was gone, and then they saw her up there.
Look, generally that's maybe the case, and it may be something she did with a very, very close friend or tightly held, assistance. But I think everybody's, at least they voiced sort of surprise at this.
Yeah.
But she got down. Yeah, she was taken down. And apparently she apologized afterwards.
I hope she apologized, because that's just something that, you wouldn't do. But also, I want to talk about when she exited the courthouse and her talking about Trump's immigration policy, calling Trump a monster, and saying that it was his draconian zero tolerance policy on immigration has to go. In a democracy, we do not put children in cages, period. That's what she said. And you could hear in the background, because I watched the video, that there were people cheering. Now, I don't know if there were. Yeah, there were.
I was there. There were supporters who were in the courtroom. The courtroom was packed with reporters and supporters of her. And outside, they had a group of supporters, and they were cheering her on. And when she made comments about Trump and criticized Trump, they cheered her on. And when she evoked Michelle Obama's name, they cheered her on.
Right.
And then after that, she was getting a few questions. One question that they didn't answer directly was, what do you say to the people who, in substance, what do you say to the people, who had to have their vacation, their trip cut short?
Right.
And she didn't address that directly. Her attorney said something, well, they should be happy that she's defending their rights.
Right.
And that's, after that, the press availability ended, and everybody sort of walked away.
Yeah, because, when I heard that quote, from her attorney, I kind of wished she would say something like that. But in my opinion, I thought that was kind of a cheap shot of that kind of a quote, because, I don't understand it. I mean,
it didn't answer the specific question. If you listen, the question was,
exactly.
How do you feel? And she didn't get to answer that.
Yeah, she was kind of like trying to skew it and kind of doing like that. So I want to talk about some of the people that were evacuating, and I want to know, did they get refunds?
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I really hope they do.
You'll probably hear about it down the road. People were evacuated rather hastily. I don't know what the refund policy is on that. I mean, they get to the island, and then they have to pay, and then they're suddenly bundled up and going away. I suppose there's some way they can get reimbursed.
Yeah,
this is an extenuating circumstance, and I would hope that the Parks Service has a way of at least compensating people who could show a loss.
Right.
Clearly this is an unusual thing. It's not the usual thing I cover. I cover crime and
right.
and things of that sort, and I write true crime books and whatnot. But this was definitely unusual.
Yeah, and I have one more question. I do want to talk about your book, but one more question is, how are the NYPD going to handle this in the future if something like this ever happens again?
Well, I spoke to the cops, in fact, today about in the emergency services unit, and they say, look, we train for stuff at the statue all the time. Mm-hmm. We train very often for people who might get ill inside the statue, like they go up to the crown or whatever, the torch, or you can't go to the torch, but get up to the crown where there's observation deck. We train to get people down who get sick, supposedly. They've had rescues, and I was told this. They had a parasailer who apparently got hung up on the crown some years ago, and they had to get that person down. Then there was another person, I think, who may have done a protest around on top of the crown, and they got that person down.
Right.
And they do this all the time, I'm told. I mean, they train for this high altitude window washer rescues. But this is unusual.
Right.
Yeah, this is unusual. You got a national landmark,
right.
And it's not the easiest surface to work on. But these guys seem to assess the situation pretty well.
I mean, you got to give credit to the NYPD. I mean, they worked really hard to get her off there.
But they took their time.
Yeah, they took their time, and that's what's great about it. And so, Tony, I want to talk about this, your book right now, and just in case for the listeners, and they wanted to bring it up, you have a new true crime book.
Right. Yes, that's right. It's actually somewhat Long Island based. It's called Top Hoodlum. Frank Costello, Prime Minister of the Mafia, and it's about Frank Costello, obviously, who was the sort of grand man of the mob in the 40s and 50s, and he lived in for a while. He had lived a good portion of his life in Sands Point, as well as Central Park, and he did a lot of bootlegging activity through Long Island in the Prohibition era, and he became the face of organized crime in the 50s when they had the Kefauver hearings, which first sort of laid out, the national impact of organized crime and the mafia in the United States. And Costello's, became the face of it. And everybody was in rapt attention because this was television's first big spectacle of that period, the hearings. And everybody heard Costello's gravelly voice, and they saw his fidgeting hands on TV, and he became sort of like the emblematic image of organized crime at that time. Yeah. And he survived, actually. I mean, he died of natural causes. Wow. But he lived out in Sands Point and tried to be like a country squire in his declining days. So it's a fascinating story. The first done on him in probably 40 years. Okay. And a lot of archival photographs, a lot of photographs from old Newsday interview he did back in 1950. Wow. Which he thought was going to be this way of showing he was legit. And so it was fun to do. Yeah. And but it was a lot of work. Yeah. As you can imagine. It's a very, it's in many ways a Long Island story. Okay. And do you know where listeners can purchase the book? Oh, yeah, the usual places, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's on Kindle, in the bookstores. It's, the usual places to pick it up. It's Top Hoodlum is the name. And, people can relate to some of the stuff because it is history, but it's really not too far back history. Yeah, all righty. Thank you, Tony, for calling up. Well, thank you, and thank you very much for having me. And like I said, this is an evolving story on the statue, and the criminal case will go on, and we'll see how it gets resolved. All righty. Thanks, Tony. Thank you. All righty. All right, so that was Tony Destefano from Newsday talking about the woman who climbed the Statue of Liberty.